When the cult classic film Repo Man came out in 1984, it's hard to understand why Universal Pictures would be interested in such an edgy, gritty, and strange film under the first-time direction of director Alex Cox. But when the film immediately flopped at the box office, Universal pulled it out of theaters in just 1 week. Now, for most films, probably all films, that would pretty much be the end of that. But for Repo Man, a different story emerged. After being fired from his job, Los Angeles slacker and punk Otto, played by Emilio Estevez, lands a gig working for an eccentric repossession agent named Bud, played by Harry Dean Stanton. At first, Otto was reluctant to work as a repo man, but he grows to love the fast-paced job. After learning of a Chevy Malibu that has been given a $20,000 price tag, Otto embarks on a quest to find the car with the beautiful Layla, played by Olivia Barash, who claims the trunk contents are otherworldly. So Universal greenlit the independent feature in a negative pickup deal, which means that they would purchase and distribute it after it was completed. But really, it seemed like nobody at the time understood its value except for the people who made it. But that's exactly when these strange external forces started to rise up and take hold and push Repo Man down a different path. And one of the first strange things that started to emerge was that even though it had been pulled out of theaters after just 1 week, it started to get some really positive reviews from some big names, most notably Roger Ebert from Siskel and Ebert out of Chicago. Here's what Roger Ebert wrote in part in 1984. Repo Man is one of those movies that slips through the cracks and gives us all a little weirdo fun. It's the first movie I know that combines punk teenagers, automobile repossessors, and aliens from outer space. This is the kind of movie that baffles Hollywood because it isn't made from any known formula and doesn't follow the rules. But what's best about Repo Man is its sly sense of humor. There's a lot of running gags in the movie. It also has a special way of looking at Los Angeles, seeing it through Harry Dean Stanton's eyes as a wasteland of human ambitions where a few bucks can be made by the quick, the bitter, and the sly. Repo Man comes out of left field, has no big stars, didn't cost much, takes chances, dares to be unconventional, is funny, and works. There's a lesson here. And even though this review went a long way, I'm sure, it still sat there in apparent death, just not moving, on the shelf, collecting dust. Fortunately, MCA Records had made a deal to release the soundtrack on its new, edgy subsidiary, San Andreas Records. And then what happens next is really astounding. 6 months after Repo Man came out, people started to notice that the soundtrack to Repo Man was flying off the shelves. It was shooting up the charts, and there was a cult following growing around it. The soundtrack was full of 80s LA punk bands like the Circle Jerks, Suicidal Tendencies, and the Plugs. It even had its main title song, Repo Man, written by Iggy Pop. Once everybody noticed that the album and soundtrack were selling so well, Universal Pictures reassessed what it had, and the film was relaunched to critical acclaim and modest commercial success. So in a sense, you could say that there was a cluster of LA punk bands in the 1980s that saved Repo Man. And you could probably give some credit to Roger Ebert as well. And there's probably an argument that if something is good art, it will find its way to resurface. I mean, there's no way to know that, but good art tends, especially if it's unique, tends to be sort of looked at poorly or regarded as poorly when it comes out. It's not well understood. In the case of this movie, you could probably make the argument that it never got a fair shake initially with only 1 week in the theaters. That doesn't leave much time for exposure. As the great marketer Rory Sutherland once said, a flower is a weed with an advertising budget. There aren't many people who can understand new ideas when they first emerge. They usually seem confusing, off-putting, or bizarre. It's hard for people to see it for what it is. But the value of Repo Man has continued to grow since it first came out. Even for me, rewatching it after all these years, I had a lot of trouble connecting with it. And I'm not sure why this happens to me. Maybe it happens to other people, but I started watching half of it. I paused it. I wasn't getting into it. I did some things. I came back to it, watched it, and I thought it was fantastic when I finished it. And I don't know if it's just like sort of, I needed time to sort of digest and absorb what was happening to be able to see that what was unfolding in front of me was super cool and unique and edgy and gritty and had these interesting things to say. On top of the fact that you're getting a very early look at the up-and-coming Emilio Estevez, the legendary Harry Dean Stanton is great, and Fox Harris is amazing in it, playing J. Frank Parnell. I mean, it's one of the great performances of the 80s. And there's a lot of interesting messaging going on in the movie. For example, one is perhaps its take on capitalism. An interesting aspect of that is when you see Otto at the supermarket job early in the film, surrounded by a sea of consumer products. They're all labeled generically like beer for beer and, chips for chips. But he's a rebel. He gets fired. He walks off the job. He pushes a guy over into the cans, his coworker. He flips off the security guard who's pointing a gun at him, and he generally doesn't care. But after a while, of course, he needs that money, and he ends up getting lured into being a repo man by Bud. What's interesting is that becoming a repo man, it's very strange, but an interesting choice, because he goes from being someone who detested consumers and jobs and maybe consumerism to being someone who would actually work for the authority side of it and repossess people's products if they didn't pay up. And if you take a look at the coworker he pushes over onto the cans before he quits his job, and one of the producers mentioned this, but you couldn't make Napoleon Dynamite without that character. Do you know what I mean? It's almost a direct ripoff. And when he uncovers him at the hospital and he says Otto, and then Otto covers him back up, he's just kind of walking by. I howled with laughter. It's so funny. There's so many moments like that. If you kind of see it for what it is and not, see it through the lens of, I'm just going to accept this for whatever it is and try to embrace it. But whatever it is about this movie that's great, whatever it is that makes it live on as a cult classic, none of that would be possible, probably, if it weren't for a group of LA punk bands in the 1980s. And Roger Ebert. And Iggy Pop. I mean, whatever Iggy Pop touches is great, right?